I am going to discuss today our journey in GenAI at Scotiabank and what lessons we learned along the way. More specifically, we will discuss how we approach sourcing ideas across the bank. We will discuss the families of GenAI as we see them and their applications, especially for financial use cases. We will discuss 3 use cases that we have implemented at Scotiabank, and finally, the lessons we learned along the way. So to start with, to source the ideas for GenAI use cases across the bank, we started a use case inventory. I'm sure that's not too revolutionary. We collected use case ideas from across the bank, from all the business lines and all the corporate functions. Scotiabank is a fairly large company. We have 90,000 employees. We cover 25 countries, so there's a lot of ideas. You can see some inventory highlights on the right. We gathered a grand total of nearly 100 use cases. Those are deduplicated use cases, meaning many times different groups, different employees proposed essentially the same use case ideas. So those are really unique use case ideas. They were sourced from over 25 teams, again, from across the bank. The types of GenAI that were proposed included text generation, knowledge management, natural language understanding, and software generation, essentially all the facets that GenAI can cover. The submitted use cases were and are continuously being evaluated on 4 core dimensions so that we know which ones to prioritize. The 4 dimensions are the value drivers, what can drive value based on this use case ID. Is it going to be around productivity improvements? Is it going to be around customer experience or employee experience? Will it help us with our risk management? Of course, as a financial institution, this is a very key function for us. Is the use case ID scalable? Can we use it for other business lines or other corporate functions or other groups, generally speaking? The effort needed, of course, is the second dimension for the prioritization. How much data prep is going to be needed if we want to put this in production? Is there any integration needed with any process, or is it a standalone tool? Do we need to train our employees further to use this, or is it going to be intuitive to them? How much change management is required if we put this use case in production? So all of that has to do with how much work is needed to bring something to fruition. And then, of course, the last part is what are the risk drivers, and do we have mitigations for those risk drivers? So the risks for GenAI, everybody knows them by now. What is going to be the impact of a mistake? There might be concerns around bias, fairness, copyright, or privacy. All of this you have to look at upfront. 70% of the use cases we received were deemed to be to deliver significant impact, or are expected to deliver significant impact. That means we are intending to look further into them. However, for risk appetite considerations, we decided to first look only at employee-facing use cases. So quite a few of those ideas were going to be customer-facing or client-facing. This is complicated for a bank. We need to be very exact, very precise when we talk to our customers. You don't want to answer a wrong number if someone asks you an interest rate question, and so on. So facing only employees helps us mitigate a lot of the risks. Employees know their jobs, employees know the processes they are following, employees can be trained, and employees are not going to try to defeat the models, right? They are not going to attack it. Now, we also noticed that different use cases can be addressed with different families of LLM products. So what are the families? This is how we see them. The first family is chatbots in general. Of course, ChatGPT is the archetype. Scotiabank allows employees to use Microsoft Web Copilot. It used to be called Bing Chat. We ask employees not to put any bank data, any private data in there. But we have obviously an MSA with Microsoft. They don't use our data for training and so on. The second family of LLM products is the commercial off-the-shelf products that are integrated with LLMs, that have LLMs in them. Examples of that are GitHub Copilot, which helps software developers write software faster. It has been rolled out at Scotiabank for all the software developers who want it, and the pilot users of GitHub Copilot told us that they are between 10 and 20% more efficient. So that means they save up to 1 day per week. For an organization as large as ours, with literally thousands of software developers, this is a very meaningful use case. Office 365 Copilot is, of course, Microsoft Office with LLMs embedded in each of the products. So Word, Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and Teams. In Teams, it can summarize meetings. It can look up, when you talk to someone the last time, and so on. Google Duet AI is Google's version of that for Google's version of Office, which is called Workplace. Finally, the last family is really custom tools that use the LLM APIs that are made available to us by the big vendors or that can be from open source LLMs. So this is really any integration of LLMs into existing processes. Examples of that are knowledge management, the famous RAG use case that really everybody is pursuing, or chatbot summarization, and we will come back to this. The 3 families of LLM products can be matched with 3 families of use cases, and you will remember that we are focusing only on employees. So the 3 families of use cases are general productivity for employees, tools that can help all employees be a little bit more productive. As I mentioned, chatbot, Bing Chat, Web Copilot, or ChatGPT are examples of that. They are very cheap or free, and they bring some value, but not a lot of value. Some things like Microsoft 365 Copilot are reasonably cheap. You just have to deploy it, and they bring reasonable value. We will see a little bit more about that. Custom tools for employees are things that are useful for specific groups of employees. So not general productivity, but things that help one specific job or process that employees are doing. An example of that is GitHub Copilot, again, just for the software developers. Pretty cheap license, but very high impact. Custom API-based tool that is written for specific groups of employees. One example is Ask AI, which is what we called our RAG system. It's pretty expensive because you have to do it. There is no out-of-the-box system right now that will give you the performance you need to really be used by the business. But the impact is pretty significant. If you have a system that can answer advisors' questions as they are on the phone with the customer, that is significantly better than the old search that we used to have, where you have to open the documents returned by the search, then look for your answer in those documents. And finally, the last family of use cases is really back office automation, and those are the use cases where there is no user interface. The LLM is doing something in the background for you, which makes a process essentially smoother, more efficient, faster, cheaper. An example of that is chatbot summarization, and we will get back to that shortly. In the rest of my talk, I'm going to cover 3 of those use cases. So I will talk a little bit more about what Copilot is doing for us at Scotiabank. I will talk about our RAG, Ask AI, and I will talk about one back office automation via LLMs, chatbot summarization. Starting with Microsoft 365 Copilot, we ran a few months ago, actually nearly a year ago, a pilot of Microsoft Office 365 Copilot with 300 pilot users. And of course, at the end of that pilot, we asked them many, many questions. One of the questions was, how useful do you find the thing? And the average, we had those 300 users came from, again, all the business lines and all the corporate functions at Scotiabank. And across everyone, the average usefulness rating was 3.9 out of 5. So if you think of a rating from 1 to 5 stars, 3.9 is pretty good. Not fantastic, but definitely useful. And then we looked at how that relates across the different groups that answered the survey. So you see here on the left, the groups that gave it the highest ratings, so audit, compliance, and risk management. All of them were quite a bit above average, 4.2 to 4.4. And we are skipping the middle groups. The groups that gave it the lowest ratings were operations and finance. So this is interesting, and it's also not a surprise because the groups on the left, audit, compliance, risk management, they are very document heavy. They read documents, they evaluate documents, they compare documents, they make sure that documents are what's expected from them, and so on. And of course, large language models are called large language models, not large numeric models. And finance, on the other side, deals with numbers much more than with words. As a result, they find this type of tool less useful for them. Still, as a result of this pilot, we decided to roll out very widely Copilot 365, and we currently have many thousands of licenses that have been rolled out at the bank. We also asked our users what they find, for a list of tasks, whether they find Copilot useful or not. I won't read the whole slide, but basically the top two. With Copilot, it's easier to summarize my meetings and create action items. And using Copilot helps me spend less mental effort on mundane and repetitive tasks. And the bottom two, with Copilot, it's easier to create tables and charts. Not so much. And with Copilot, it's easier to create virtually appealing presentation slides. Again, not so much. My interpretation of that is that language is a one-dimension thing. It's one word after word after word after word. It's really a list of words, whereas things like charts and PowerPoints are all 2D things, right? You don't make a chart with a list. You don't make a PowerPoint with a list. You need 2 dimensions. And LLMs are not great at that. Switching to the next use case I want to review, Ask AI, which is again our RAG tool. So the question we want to answer here is we want to use GenAI for knowledge management. And again, the question is, can we help employees get their answers faster? We have many groups of employees. We have countless documentation. And so this would be, of course, extremely useful for us. And the answer is, it sounds simple, but it's not that simple. So this is the general RAG methodology. You have a list of documents. You have a user query. You are going to vectorize all your documents using specific embedding models. You will also vectorize your user query. And then you retrieve the documents that are the most semantically similar to the user query. And then you build a prompt that says something like, Dear LLM, given the following documents, you paste your documents. Please answer the following question, and you paste the user's query, the user's question. And then the response is generated. And typically, it is more likely than not to use the context provided in the prompt rather than to use the base training data to answer the question. The problem with that is there are many degrees of freedom when we want to build something like this. Again, it sounds pretty straightforward, but it's not. There's lots of knobs you can tweak, lots of degrees of freedom, or lots of hyperparameters to set in AI parlance. For example, when we are talking about vectorizing anything, the queries or the documents, well, first of all, which embedding model do you use? When you look at your documents, what level do you vectorize at? Is it a whole document? Is it a page, a paragraph, a section? Do you add context to every document you index, and so on? Lots of possibilities there. When you talk about identifying the most similar documents, again, there is not a single answer to that. You have to experiment. You can also combine semantic search that is vector-based with lexical search that is string-based. When you are talking about creating the prompt, it depends on what model you are using. Not all models work best with the same prompt. There's lots of ways to phrase the prompt with lots of places where you can find the context and so on. So again, lots of possibilities here. The biggest, and I think that has been a recurring theme during this conference, the biggest piece of work that we have to do is on the documentation itself. Of course, in this case, the documentation is the data. We've heard many times, and I'm going to say it one more time, the data matters a lot for any ML product. It is particularly true for GenAI and RAG. So your documentation is not necessarily going to be all in the same format. And I mean, format can be PDF, HTML, Word, and so on. But it can also be, one document may have 100 pages and another one maybe 1 page. And they work at different levels and so on. So working on that, you may also have older versions of the same documents, right, that have somehow not been cleaned up. And if by using a search engine, the user of the search will know whether this is the latest document or not, but the LLM with this context typically would not. So a lot of the work goes on making the documentation LLM friendly, essentially. There's also one more variable, one more, again, hyperparameter. It's how exactly do you evaluate the answers from this entire system, right? It's not going to be like classification. It's not either right or wrong. There's degrees of quality for the answers that the model is going to give you. There is a framework, RAGAS. There's also really the quality score that final users attribute to it. So this is our first experiment in creating our RAG system, our Ask AI. We did this for the back office group that implements payment requests that we get from our corporate and commercial customers. And what you see here is the quality score from red, which means lie, which means inaccurate answer. So of course, that's what we really want to avoid. The 2 shades of gray are not lies. They are just essentially irrelevant answers. The answer doesn't really answer the question. It's just that it's accurate, but not on topic. And the 2 shades of green are good or perfect answers. So what we want to do is to obviously maximize the percentage of green on the chart. And you can see here 17 experiments that the team went through, and some of them are here. The very first experiment had a lie rate of above 50%. The very last experiment, which is currently in production with test users, had no lies at all and nearly 95% of high quality answers. What happened along the way is essentially all those knobs that I mentioned about are being tweaked bit by bit. So we worked on document chunking, we worked on adding documents because some of them were missing. We upgraded the LLMs that we use to serve those models. We added hybrid search, again, semantic and lexical. We added metadata to our documents and so on. So it's you have to iterate, you have to work on it. Eventually you'll get there, but it takes time. Now, on the positive side, this is the second bot we built. This one is for the contact center. So this one is for the contact center advisors to use while they are on the phone with a customer. You can see the very first iteration had over 60% good quality answers. And the second iteration were almost at 90% with hardly any inaccurate answers. And this is just 2 iterations. In 2 iterations, the team did nearly as well as in 17 iterations before. So what we are observing here is the team learning how this thing works and, of course, reusing the software it has created for the first one. Last point I'm going to touch on is our chatbot summarization, back office automation. The context here is that Scotiabank has a customer-facing chatbot. The chatbot itself is non-LLM, or rather I should say it's non-Gen AI. Anything that the chatbot prints has been written by a Scotiabanker. It is not generated by the LLM. We do use LLM to understand the customer's intent, but not to answer the customer. Our chatbot can answer roughly 40% of the customer sessions, meaning the customer will find the answer they are looking for 40% of the time. 20% of the time, the session is abandoned. The customer moves on and forgets to come back. And 40% of the time, the session is handed over to a live chat advisor. So the customer stays within live chat. They can speak to someone without leaving the chat session. And of course, when we do that, when the customer is handed over to a live advisor, we don't want the live advisor to restart from scratch with the customer, right? That takes time, not good for the bank, not good for the customer. They have to repeat everything. Nobody wants to do that. So we used to give the live chat advisor the transcript of the customer bot session, so the advisor could read what has happened so far and pick it up from there with the customer. But the transcripts are long and unpleasant. So what we did was use GenAI to summarize those transcripts into a summary that is about 70% shorter, so that's faster to read. But that also is formatted in a specific way that our clients, our internal clients, the advisor, asked us to do. So we worked very closely with them to create the summary format that is the most useful for them to pick up a session with a client. For example, the summary highlights the product and the transaction, if any, that were being discussed between the customer and the bot. This was our first GenAI use case in production at Scotiabank, and it went to production in January this year. Just to give you guys an idea of what exactly that looks like, this is an example of a raw transcript between a customer who wants to inquire, inquire on the status of a refund they asked for. And this is the formatted summary, so much cleaner, much shorter, in an English that is a lot easier to understand by the agent. This is a really good use of GenAI because it uses the strength of LLMs. LLMs, again, are good at language and nothing else, in my view. It is employee-facing, so we don't risk anyone attacking it or trying to abuse it, which makes it low risk. It's also good for customers. They have to wait less long to speak to an agent. It's good for the bank. We can talk to customers faster. We spend less time talking to them. The feedback from the front line was very positive. They all love it, which seeing the two versions, full transcript versus summary, makes sense. And I'm going to conclude now on the lessons we learned during those use cases and many, many more, along what it means for ID collections, for risk management, for experimentation, and for execution, delivering to prod. So ID collection, really the question is, where can GenAI be useful? And that's not a simple answer. An earlier presentation talked about the ragged landscape of use cases that are friendly or not friendly for GenAI. So crowdsourcing is a good way to do that, but also setting up very close collaborations between your GenAI practice and the business. The GenAI practitioners know what GenAI can do and not do, and the business know how their processes work and what they are trying to do. And the question is always, where is the right match? What part of the process can GenAI improve? Realistic expectation matters a lot. An earlier presentation from RBC mentioned that after a GenAI call, they thought, oh, they just need a regular expression. And that happens to us quite a bit too. So GenAI is not always the answer. You have to use it only when it makes sense. Prioritization based on cost, impact, and risk will help you, of course, focus on the best use cases first. Commercial off-the-shelf tools, again, the Copilot, GitHub, and Microsoft is a low-hanging fruit, so something to try first. Relatively easy to deploy, relatively cheap with relatively good benefits. And finally, consider reusability. If you can create a tool that is used by multiple groups, obviously that has a big impact on the ROI. Second, around managing risk, have a close collaboration with your second line of defense, with your AI risk team. Employee-facing mitigates a lot of potential problems. One of the biggest one is employees are not going to adversarially try to attack your LLMs. And if they do, there will be consequences. Explicitly consider the questions around accuracy, fairness, bias, transparency. Again, when you do employee-facing, a lot of those risks are mitigated. And perform control rollouts. It's important to always remember that GenAI is imperfect, and a controlled rollout with testing groups first, ideally managers, so that they know the job better and they can comment on the GenAI is a good idea. On experimenting, again, what aspect of a process can GenAI augment? Which platform is the most appropriate to run your LLMs? Is it Microsoft, OpenAI, Google? Is it open source? There's going to be integration considerations based on which existing process the final product will have to be integrated. What specific model? Obviously, it's always good to take the smallest model that is good enough for your objectives. However, what we found, and again, because we are considering only employee-facing use cases, it's very easy to just take the biggest possible model. It is cheap anyway when you are talking about small volumes, employee-facing. Collaboration between business, AI, data, and tech will be critical. All of those aspects, all of those teams will have a role in the final rollout. Pair programming is, each time you look at a use case, really have sitting side by side, ideally, or being in close contact on teams, the LLM experts, the GenAI practitioners, and the business users who know what they want to do with LLM, and keep repeating or keep iterating. Finally, on execution, creating a COE, I think, is an important part. It's good to centralize your GenAI talent. They can learn from each other. Nobody is really an expert at that. It's still, there are not many experts at that. It's still a beginning field, and it's important that experts learn from each other. I mentioned pair programming. We discussed data quality. Integration with legacy systems is also complex. So again, vendor choice and considerations around integration. It's important to monitor results. Gen AI is AI. We all know that data drift, AI models drift, and so on. That is true of Gen AI too. So monitor your results as your tools are being used. And of course, correspondingly, collect feedback, and then iterate and scale. If you want to learn more about the AI team at Scotiabank, what we do, career options, and so on, please visit scotiabank.ai. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Yannick. I see we have a few questions.
Thank you so much. I really like presentation that was visualized. I have a question. I always have problem to get an appointment and fix something with my bank account. I'm wondering what's your idea, how far we are that I go to the app, click on that, and I can have video call with a chatbot or anything, and quickly I can solve the problem without going to the bank, making an appointment. I mean that advisor is in the app. I just click on that and I can fix that. How far we are?
So we have already delivered it for some use cases. So for example, if you want to make an appointment, the chatbot will be able to guide you with that.
No, I mean, I just click on that and I will connect it to a chatbot or anything, and I can fix the problem right away.
Yeah, it is true in some cases, but not true yet in most cases, largely for questions of risk appetite. So for example, one of the popular conversations on our chatbot is around changing limits, changing your ATM cash limit, for example. Mm-hmm. This is something that we could deliver. We could do what you want, but for risk appetite reasons, we have decided that, at least at this point in our journey, we want an advisor to actually be in the loop when any kind of limit changes. And so the chatbot will know what you want to do, but it will say, oh, I see you want to change your ATM cash limit. I cannot do that for you, but I'm going to transfer over to an advisor who will help you do that. So I think we will go in your direction, but bit by bit. Mm-hmm. Again, largely for risk appetite questions, right? The more automation you include, the more risk for unexpected consequences might occur. Yeah. If you keep a human in the loop, the advisors know what they are doing. So it's more expensive for the bank and slightly more annoying for you, but fewer things can go wrong.
Yeah, thank you. And another question is that with face recognition, whether we can fix this problem if we use face recognition, that maybe the chatbot or they will understand from our eye or anything that this is the right person, and we can fix and do that limitation problem with the chat as well.
You mean for authentication?
Yeah, for risk, for the risk part.
So it's not only what you have in mind is just one kind of risk, right? It's someone impersonating someone else, but there's many, many more things that can go wrong.
Thank you.
Dr. Lallement, fantastic presentation. Can you tell us a little bit about how you scoped Ask AI? It seems like you sort of started with the finance bot and then you went to the customer center bot. Obviously, picking that second use case was part of the 2 versus 17. This is potentially an infinite program. How are you sort of selecting the next thing and the next thing and the next thing to work on?
There's a few criteria. One of the, and we have a grid, so I don't have the grid exactly in mind, but one of the criteria is how complex is the documentation. So if your documentation is, 20,000 pages, you will be lower on the list than if your documentation is 1,000 pages. That's partly why we decided to go with the payments group first before the contact center. Of course, conversely, the size of the user pool matters as well, right? And there are fewer employees, obviously, doing commercial payments than answering the phone. But those are the two main things we look at. Again, cost and effort, right? I mean, cost and benefits.
Yeah, thanks for that insight.
Hi there. I have one question. So what are the current blockers and also kind of advancement you need to see in order to move from POC to production, also from employee use cases to external? I'm asking specifically from the perspectives of LLM development and the ecosystem, such as infrastructure and etc. Thank you.
There's probably a few, but I think the most salient one for me is the problem with the LLM hallucinations, right? If you make a mistake to an employee, it's not ideal, but the employee has a good chance of recovering, even realizing that this is a mistake and then going back to the source documentation. The moment you put that in front of customers, it's a much more complex proposition. And the moment you make that public, you will have people trying to abuse it, which that problem, as far as I know, hasn't been solved. Once it's solved, there will be many more options to use GenAI throughout the bank for sure.
Yes, but other than RAG, to solve that hallucination, what else are you exploring?
I think that's mostly done by OpenAI and Google, right? Not so much by the banks.
Okay, we have one last question.
Thanks for your presentation. My question is about the metrics. Like, what kind of metrics did you use to evaluate the performance of these products? And also, was there any sort of like a benchmark or goal or threshold that makes you decide, okay, we are good enough, so we can move on to the next?
So to the second question, yes, the benchmark is set by the business. They tell us, to be able to roll this out in production, the accuracy or the quality, depending on what exactly you measure, excuse me, needs to be at least this much. So that always happens. To your first question, it depends on the use case, right? If you want to create a summary, for example, you'll need a measure of how reflective of the actual transcript the summary is, right? How accurate it is. If you want to create a RAG, you need a measure of did you answer the question the way it was supposed to be answered. So that was the quality rating that I showed between 0, which is a lie, and 5.
Those are from like a users, right? Like whether user liked it or not. Like I think like the conventional ones, like a sum up or sum down, or
So we also collect that, but we haven't started to use it yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. In a figure of time, let us all thank Yannick again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.